Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. We're at episode 14, and today we're going to talk about allied strategies in Crimson VOW. And by allied strategies, I mean decks in allied color pairs. And allied color pairs, if you don't know, go on the back side of the card, and the ones that are next to each other are allied. The ones that are on the opposite side of the pentagon that the color dots make are enemy color pairs. And why allied strategies in particular? It's because there is a big difference between how they are drafted in this particular set. Looking at the color combinations, it seems that I don't know if it's per design. I actually put that question forward to Mark Rosewater for his mailbag. Let's see if it gets answered. But for some reason, the allied color pairs are drafted way more than enemy color pairs, and we're talking more than 2 times more frequently. I think that the most drafted deck is Rakdos, that has around 40,000 drafts now on games now in 17 lands data set, like pure Rakdos without any splash. And except for white black, all the enemy color pairs are showing their numbers in mid 10,000, so like 14, between 10,000 and 18,000 or something like that. White black is a bit more drafted because I think that the synergy is a bit more obvious in that one. So that's a big difference. And because of that, I'll focus on decks that are most drafted for that particular reason. And next week, I'm going to talk about the enemy color pairs if I bloody have enough time to do the analysis, because those things take ages. That's why partially we are delayed with that one. I'm also going to talk about why is data in Crimson Vow not as telling as it was in the previous sets, and it's not as telling as in previous sets, I can tell you that already. And it's not only the card data, because the card data we can easily get that, but I'm talking about this approaches that I'm doing, looking at synergies, looking at sub-synergies in color pairs, finding out different builds. Not as easy to do in this set as it was in the previous ones, and I think that there are good reasons for that. But despite that, we can still draw some conclusions out of the data set, so it's not a complete waste of time for you, don't worry. So I'm going to just briefly talk about how can we still use that data that we have to improve the performance, and also maybe speculate about how can we approach the data differently, and maybe figure out some things from different data subsets that will be so hopefully available sooner or later, to design a pipeline of data analysis that is more suited for the sets like this one. And I think that this set is sort of going together with Terra's Beyond as one of the two sets that were markedly different than the other sets in terms of their philosophy, and also because of that, markedly poorer for my win rate. I'm really struggling with the win rate so far in Crimson Vow. I'm not the only one, because I heard lots of people doing that. And I think that there's reasons for that. And part of it is my personal reasons, and mainly is my loose play, especially when it comes to the strategy planning for more than one turn ahead. I know that I'm pretty poor at that, and because also I don't get like 100% involved in my playing. I like to play, but if it was like 1999, I would have probably been good because I was decent in those drafts. But it's different. I think it's more like draft like it's 2007. Jordan says that draft like it's 1999. I think it's more like 2007. And 2007 is the time when I retired, and I completely missed that revolution. I missed the whole middle part of Magic development, this incremental advantage play. The play style that most of the current old pros that are still playing were raised in. I miss those times. And I think that by missing those times, I missed a lot of assets in terms of my gameplay abilities, because Magic changed by a lot from when I was playing the first time. And I sort of skipped that part. I came at the end, and it was not that disturbing for Limited, because Limited changed as I entered or re entered Magic. But some of those, well, let's call them boomer sets, are problematic for me because I missed those fundamentals from Constructed that you gained by playing in those formats. But okay, without further ado, my preamble. So these are obvious statements, but they are maybe not put enough attention to. But it's not only about deck building and the draft portion in limited. Playing is important, and I think that it's not really, this format really makes it more visible than any other, because of several factors that lead to it. First of all, color pairs are relatively even. There is not much difference between different color pairs in terms of win rate. Um, but also at the same time, the common level is pretty flat, and two drops are not amazing, which means that games last longer. And this set, the games last markedly longer than in the previous ones. The longer the game takes, the more important small mistakes from the early stage accrue into disadvantage in the later game. And on top of that, we are also quite bomb heavy, which means that if the game lasts longer, your chances of drawing a bomb are higher, which means that you can't go under the bombs like you could in the previous sets, where you basically aggro could beat a deck before the bombs became relevant. And all these factors combined mean that in this set, like in previous sets, I could look at the data, analyze the color pairs, figure out the optimal way of drafting, um, and basically gain probably like good 10 percentage point advantage just by knowing exactly what I need to do in terms of drafting, how to position myself in a deck. Here I can't do it. I'm either reliant on opening a bomb or in playing really well while having a decent solid deck. Like a decent solid deck will not push you through to the trophy unless you play it flawlessly, because the power level is so flat that your deck, even if it's decently built, is not going to be that much stronger than anything you're playing. And also, because color pairs are relatively even, you can't even position yourself in a better deck because you know how to draft and you know what is the better positioned deck. So all these factors compound. There is another problem, and this is something to do with how the set is constructed, but even though you will have those 20x commons in each color, um, they don't all belong to the particular builds. And because of that, you really operate on a very limited amount of cards in your deck, which makes the decks, apart from the uncommons that will vary wildly, but it makes the decks very samey, which means you have absolutely no advantage unless you discover some secret tech, which you can't, because we would have known that. The data would tell you the secret tech already, and you would have known that from this particular podcast uh, or whatever. I mean, people will figure that out because people watch the data, people read the data, and people understand it. So because you have like this limited amount of commons that fit in the deck, and the ones that don't fit, clearly the data shows that they don't fit, and therefore you shouldn't put them. You're limited to a very small subset of cards in each color combination. There are very few universal commons, like Traveling Minister is so good because it fits in every deck, basically. And it's one of the very few cards in the whole set. I was really struggling to find cards that are fitting into it. And on top of that, the bombs will completely reset your incremental advantage if your opponent is lucky enough. Like yesterday, I was playing the red white, and I did all right with it, like 5-3. It was nothing special. I had only commons and commons. I had the white cleave spell that the sort of like deal X damage, gain X life, which is okay in white red, but you know nothing like special. That won't change the outcome of the game. It's just a very very good removal. And I played the games. I won 5 of them, and then I play my last one. I'm 5-2, and I built this incremental advantage. I was actually modestly proud of myself how I navigated the game. I played around. I played around some counters, but I saw that my opponent was played one ramp creature, played another ramp creature, started playing lands even though they had ways of doing something. So in my head, I said, okay, they are building mana to some bomb. And I did as much as I could until they were at like 5, and then they just dropped the hexproof mythic, and that's it. The game finished there and then, because I didn't have enough reach to deal with their creatures, they just quickly developed the board, and then they just started swinging with one creature for my lethal, basically, and that was it. Because I ran out of resources trying to manage their board and trying to kill the bloody mana producers, and that was it. That was basically it. And you'll have a lot of games like this in here. I'm not trying to be salty or anything. It just happens, and it's good to understand when your opponent is trying to build into a bomb, but it will happen, and you just have to deal with that somehow. And this makes the set a bit more, yeah, the life gain. Well, I'm guilty because in the same draft, I started turn one traveling minister, turn two traveling minister, and I won that game because I basically my opponent was racing me, and I was just gaining life and racing back. And guess who won that race? Anyway, so this is like the basics of why the data is not particularly good. It's like the decks are too homogenized because of the cards only fit in a particular subset of decks. There are bombs, and this set is, I think, very much more gameplay dependent than it is draft and card knowledge dependent, like you had in the previous sets. And this makes it's problematic for people like me and maybe some of you who depend a lot on supreme understanding of drafting, basically. Which probably means that we are good arena players, but we wouldn't be very good MTGO players where everyone is proficient with draft. I think that those dynamics change, and maybe that's why some people that play in more competitive drafting formats, platforms, don't see that difference as profoundly as we do. But okay. So yeah, I think that as we analyze the data now, data gives you the biggest advantage in formats where draft portion is the most challenging part. And most of the previous formats, I think, were like that. It was that if you drafted a good deck, uh, those decks were very tolerant to some misplays. If they were small misplays, now you can't skip playing lands or something. But if you made small misplays, your deck was tolerant to those, and you still get a really good result out of that. These decks, I think, in Crimson Vow are absolutely ruthless in terms of small mistakes. Small mistakes are exactly here. This is magic of fine margin. It's more similar to Constructed in that way that small mistakes will accrue over time and will completely annihilate your chances in the late game. And like, first of all, as I said, format is not really aggro friendly. Droxical infantry somehow always gets burnt with the 2 damage spell, and you don't get any value out of it before it starts attacking. Training is too slow to be an aggressive strategy. Red can be fast, but it also is pretty grindy, so Josh is recommending not making mistakes. Thank you, Josh, for that very valuable input. Yes, it's very good input. It's just it'd be hard not to make mistakes. And then again, as I said, you will get situations when your whole game is being reset because someone just plays a Dreadfast Demon, and whatever you did before in the game doesn't matter anymore. It's just like the only question that is relevant in that moment is, do you have a response to that creature now? If the answer is no, you're dead, probably. Like, probably 80% of the time. If you do, you're alive. Hooray. You managed to play around the bomb, and you managed to keep yourself in a position and be in the deck that actually did have a response to that bomb. And Blood is actually a very difficult mechanic to play. And it's also a mechanic that lets people to dig for their bombs quicker. It is a mechanic that allows you to make mistakes, like activating Blood too early, keeping too many lands rather when you could have cycled them. There's plenty of play around in the Blood, and I think that this again is something that promotes people that play very tightly, like Josh does, which we will just rub in my face right now. Anyway, that was the preamble. Wow, 15 minutes about nothing. Brilliant. So what we're going to talk today is my approach in trying to smuggle some of my ecology research into Magic the Gathering. So basically, we'll be looking at decks and how they are related to each other. Oh, is it time for the laser pointer? Yes, it is time for the laser pointer. So basically here you have what I did is I converted 2000 decks to numbers, distances between them in terms of composition, and plotted them on 2D space. So the closer the two dots are to each other, the more similar the decks. So like for instance, these two decks will be quite similar, and this deck are very not similar. So probably complete opposite side of the spectrum of the same color pair. And when you do that most of the time with that kind of large data set that is based on a very limited number of cards, you will get this sort of blob. And I've been talking about it in previous seminars, but not everyone has watched them, so I'm going to repeat myself. So for which I apologize to the ones that already saw it. But okay, this blob doesn't tell us anything, except for that, oh, probably here it looks denser, which means that here there is like the most common builds are somewhere here. So how do we get from that blob to something useful? And I do it by looking at local win rate. And local win rate for me will be checking the average win rate of each deck and its neighbors. And you can play around with how many neighbors you take into account. For this analysis, I took 20. And then I apply it to the plot. So, okay, here my example is with 15. I did 20 for this analysis because it was just 1% of the whole blob, basically. So I decided to do it. So we have a deck A, and these are its 15 closest neighbors in the circle. And we have a deck B, and these are its closest neighbors. So these neighbors are in common for both decks, and they are each other's neighbors as well. And these four are not in common. So basically that will be the difference in win rate between those two decks. The difference like if these four were trophy decks and these four were O4s, there would be a large difference between those two dots, even though they're neighboring, because this one is closer to those. Yep. So there are several possible scenarios of that sort of analysis. Like one of the possible scenarios are like good decks are random, and that if we would make this heat map of which decks are like have highest win rate, and that's the blue ones here, which ones are very good, they will be just peppered across the plot everywhere, and you will not see like any kind of reasonable pattern in it. One possible scenario is that there is one generally good build, and okay, this is an artificially made plot. I artificially highlighted the ones in the color. But here you can see one big blob of successful decks. They're all next to each other, and everything outside of that blob is less successful, which means that these are the most similar in terms of composition, and that composition is yielding the best results. That's a possible scenario. Very unlikely, because I would expect that there will be some varied builds that can also be successful in each color pair, but it's possible. And then there's third possible scenario. There's several good builds, and they might be spread across the blob. So it means that, okay, here this is the probably canonical version of the deck. Like it's in the most common, so this is what WotC wants you to do, because people tend to draft what WotC tells them to. But there is some kind of a niche successful build somewhere here, and there is a niche successful build somewhere here that is different in terms of composition from this one. This is probably the most likely scenario of what we might observe, at least so far. That's the thing that I've seen the most. Okay, right. So this is the blob from Black Red and Crimson VOW. And as you can see, most successful decks cluster in this area, but they are not all exactly in the same place. Don't worry, we're going to look at them. Before you ask, the axes, they don't mean anything in this plot. They're just like arbitrary numbers, because I converted some multi-dimensional things into two-dimensional things. It's basically like, you have a pie and you try to cram it, or maybe the best, like pressing flowers. That's what I mathematically did to those decks. I pressed them mathematically from two-dimensional from multi-dimensional to two-dimensional, so that we can actually comprehend it, because human brain is not dealing very well with multi-dimensional plots. Basically, for some reason, we live in a three-dimensional world, and we read two-dimensional books, so we prefer the two dimensions. Okay, but yeah, generally I mean, for my eye, like without even going deep into the numbers, this looks like the black red has more or less uniform builds in terms of composition. There's not big differences between the decks. There's no some kind of a super niche build around that might be interesting. So I basically discard all the gray things because we are not really caring about that. I'm not going to look at it. One stray blue dot might be just very much variance. I'm not looking too much into those because the power of that finding might be not good enough. I might look into some kind of 4 size dots, but they are already like on the dodgy side. And I'm not going to look at every cluster because that would take ages, and I respect both mine and your time. So yeah, again, I'm sort of zooming into this area, excluding the blue dot, for the Jordan's pain. But here are the same clusters. I just skipped all the gray dots, and I divided them but very arbitrarily into those clusters. And again, the closer the clusters, the more similar the decks should be. And just to give you a look at some of them, don't worry, JS Josh, I will make a special mini analysis I will put on your Discord just on that blue dot. I'll tell you what's inside. Okay? Are we happy like that? Um, so okay, let's say this is the cluster number 1. Um, and it's numbered 1 just because of pure coincidental order on the plot. It doesn't really matter that it was one. You're on the same Discord to Jordan, you also see it. I'm serious about cluster analysis. I'm going to show you what's inside of that. Don't you worry about it. Okay, so here we have the cluster number 1, and this one I called Vampire Aggro. Ta-da! Because it has most. So basically, on this plot, I'll explain. This is the average number of a card in decks in this cluster. So you see, cluster 1. This is like roughly 25 decks, I would say, give or take. So when you find like a high number of a particular card, this is pretty significant in that cluster, I would say, because having like 2 Voldaren Epicures in 3 decks, okay, can happen. But in 25, having an average of 1.7 Voldaren Epicures, that's pretty a lot. So this is clearly blood-centric vampire build, but I would like to stress that this is a blood-centric creature centric build. So we have Voldaren Epicure, we have Blood-Crazed Socialite, Belligerent Guest, Bloodpetter Celebrant, and Falconrat Celebrants. All 5 of them produce blood and are vampires. So quite important. Then we have the package of removal, Abrade, Flame Blessed Bolt, and Bleed Dry, because why not? And Gift of Fangs close behind. We have also Ragged Recluse, which is like the honorary vampire, really, because that creature with a lot of blood synergies is becoming pretty decent, because you just by the way it will turn into a 3/3. So why not? Glutinous Guest, another blood vampire. Then we have Blood Fountain, blood. Blood Tithe Harvester, blood. Blood Hypnotist, blood. Sanguine Statuette, well, that doesn't have the word blood in it. Let me guess what sanguine means. Oh wait, blood. That's still blood. Weirdly, there's the Daybreak Combatants and Voltaic Visionary, which are not blood related, but there is Mark of Retribution, which is quite vampire centric. I mean, I guess that you have to put some kind of other drops, and Daybreak Combatants was just the one that was randomly good in that deck. I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't cry also by playing the 2/3 werewolf that has menace and becomes a 4/3. But as you can see, this is like really focused on blood, except for removal. It's only blood, 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 blood. Probably the best build for Sanguine Statuette as well, because blood. And this one is not that. It's pretty fast. This looks like it wants to be fast. Like there is the top end of the Falconrat Celebrant, but most of those things are 1 to 3 mana, well, I mean, I guess that Daybreak Combatants are not bad when you have Blood Petal Celebrants, and but I guess this is a filler card. You have to keep in mind that those cards are not always there because they should be there. They're sometimes there because they can be there. Because there's only that many cards that you can draft in a set. You have to fill your curve with something, and we'll see that with some other color combinations that you will find some cards that maybe are weird, but probably they're weird. But yeah, exactly. It's a card 23. It's something that you will just have to put. You have to put 2-drops, for example. There's not so many 2-drops, so we'll see some weird 2-drops appearing here and there in decks that they maybe don't look like they belong to. But actually, the thing that you might draw from that. Uh, oh, by the way, yeah, Dark Blob. This is quite important. I on purpose, I took 2,000 decks for every single archetype that I looked, and I did reverse sorting. So I took the 2,000 most recent decks, which means that these are at least week 2 decks. I didn't put a single week 1 deck for that reason. I wanted to exclude those early builds because in that people were playing substandard decks because we were still figuring out which cards are good, and B, people were playing against substandard decks because people were still figuring out what's good. I took that into account, and I took 2,000 most recent decks that I had in the data. So they are, I think, from the 15th of November up till 21st of November, because that was when I got the last data update. Just to give you the time frame of the analysis. Okay, right. So this is clearly the vampire cluster. So next cluster we're going to look is cluster number 5, which is slightly further down the lane from here. And this, I think I called initially a sort of like more mid-rangey version, like less aggressive version of vampires. It's still vampires, and it still has the same things. I mean, Falconer Celebrant, Bleed Dry, Ragged Recluse, Blood Petal Celebrant, Bloodlight Harvester, Flameless Bolt. All of those cards were there. It has Reckless Impulse, which was absent in the. Yeah, I mean, the fact that it has average 1.7 Celebrant, and this is slightly smaller cluster, but it still has like probably 15 decks in there. But you have basically the same cards except for the Reckless Impulse, and we have also the first sighting of Diagraph Scavenger, which is like another card that is not a vampire but does work in these decks because you kill things, you trade things, you discard things from blood. It will always be able to basically ping, and it deals decently with those larger threats. And because you're not as fast as the previous deck, you probably want to have some solutions for the later game. That's probably why Bleed Dry is by far the most dominant removal in this deck, because the longer the deck lasts, the more you want to have Bleed Dry. The faster the decks is, the more you want Abrade and the Flame Blessed Bolt, because you want to sort of clear the path for your creatures, but at the same time continue playing creatures. Here we also have Alluring Suitor, great card. I mean, I would always play, but we have things like Desperate Farmers instead of the Hasty guy, because if you play a grindier deck, maybe some Lifelink wouldn't be bad. And we fill it in with some card advantage in Blood Fountain, Pointed Discussion, and Ballista Watcher is just a generically good uncommon, so that's probably why it's there. But it's just a slightly more mid-rangey version of the first deck, still based on vampires, but with a bit of like life gain, with a bit of more like focus on hard removal rather than situational removal. Deck that will get there if you're piloting well. So in Josh's hands, maybe trophy. In my hands, like a 2-3, if I'm lucky. Okay. So we went to this cluster, we went to this cluster. Now we look at this big cluster. Cluster number 6. And I called this, well, sort of like different take on it. This is a removal deck because we have like Abrade, we have Flame Blessed Bolt. Remember in this cluster number 1, top 5 most abundant cards were creatures. And here in cluster 6, we have Abrade, Reckless Impulse, Flameless Bolt. So in top 5 things are cheap removal that lets you live until you start dropping your celebrants, your scavengers, and blood craze socialize and things like that. But it's a very similar deck to the cluster 5 in terms. It's just slightly less, more red centric. So this is what happens when you try to build this kind of mid-range vampire deck, but black maybe was not as open as in the previous one. Like this one, if you look at it from, I don't show the land data, but this one has more swamps than mountains, and this one has more mountains than swamps. That's one thing to look at it. But yeah, a braid, flameless bolt, bleed dry. Well, harvester is a sort of removal. Diagraph scavenger, sort of removal actually. Plus rending flame as the uncommon top end. So this is like attritionally based removal deck that wants to finish the game with something like Farknrat Celebrates, and yeah, that's how it operates. Okay, so and last we have this 9, cluster number 9, which is off the center. But when we go back to the general plot, it's off the center, but it's like not like super far in terms of composition. This is cluster 1, this is the cluster 9, this is the dot, and these are the outskirts of the what people do in black red, unsuccessfully, unfortunately. Okay, so 9, yeah. So 9 is interesting because this is more of a less of a vampire deck and more of a like grindy kind of life gainy sort of concoction that definitely aims at being attrition-y. So here, this one also has, I think, more swamps than mountains, if I remember correctly. But of course, every deck that is defensive wants to have cheap removal because you want to survive until you start dropping your bigger things. So Flameless Bolt is the most common card in the deck. Then we have this life gain package in there. We have Scavenger, gains 2 life when you play it. Gluttonous Guest, whenever you sacrifice blood, you gain a life. Desperate Farmer, a lifelink creature. And we have Courier Bot all of a sudden. So basically what you can do is like trade creatures early, then maybe at some stage you sacrifice blood, discard a land, play Courier Bot, get back a creature, and you're in the value town. So basically things that normally are reserved for white-black in this format, but you can sort of play this in the attritionary version of black-red. And I think that this was by far the most interesting build that was successful because it's not the obvious one. So I put it in this analysis because I thought, hey, interesting builds, maybe someone will get food for thought or something. But apart from that, Flameless Bolt, Celebrants, Scavenger's Guest, Upbraid, Bleed Dry, Reckless Impulse, Ragged Recluse, Blood Tide Harvester, Blood Craze Socialite, all these cards appeared before. The only difference is really Courier Bat and the order changes, and there is definitely more of this life gain synergies in here. So yeah, do what you want with it, but that's how it looks like. And that's basically the end of any interesting builds in black red. At least you can see certain trends in them. You can see that this is probably this line on the plot is sort of like showing that these decks will be more red, these decks will be more black, and top ones will be more aggressive, bottom one will be slightly more grindy. That's basically what these axes. They don't mean it because I didn't put like information on those axes at all. It's just how they get arranged by the method that I'm using. So yeah. Okay. Here is the red-green, and here we have a bit of a bigger spread in terms of how the archetypes are positioned. So they cover like a bigger percentage of the whole plot, those successful dots. And we have some successful dots here, and we have some successful dots here. So it seems like there's something going on. You'll be bitterly disappointed to learn that, okay, there is something going on, but maybe not as much as we would think. Okay, so I started with cluster 1. And this is like a classic your typical red-green hybrid humans and werewolves. So one of the things with werewolves is that they are also humans on their front side, so you can play some human um, human synergies with them. But we have some wolves. We have the fearful villager. We have Dawnhard Disciple as a 2-drop of choice, well, together with the Sporeback Wolf. But I think that this is mainly because of the availability. There's just not so many good 2-drops. And Blood Petal Celebrant is already pretty contested by black red decks, which you'll probably have a couple on in every pod. So what you're left with is the Dawnhard Disciple, but at least I looked through all the clusters of red green. It looks like it consistently fits in those decks, so maybe it's not absolutely terrible. It's playable in those decks, and it can be in successful versions of them. But you mainly have the wolves. You have Sporklore, sort of value. Apprentice Sharpshooter somehow fits in this deck. Maybe deals with the flyers and then lets you go to the late game. And then you have Falconra Celebrants because that's the best top end in the format, so why not? And Rural Recruit, for some reason, managed to find its place in the 4-drop slot, even though I probably would normally prefer Mariner, and Mariners will be dominant in other builds I'm going to show you, but in this particular build, Rural Recruit seems to be working okay. And this is something I saw through and through in the data, that Witch's Web is the combat trick that shows up more frequently than Massive Might, which also surprised me because I would naturally think that that Massive Might is the better one, but perhaps Witch's Web is doing exactly what. Yeah, no, I mean, I thought the same, but the data just suggests it. I mean, I'm not going to defend it until I'm dead. Maybe there's I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it is. Does it go wide? It's sort of like a value pile, really. I think that it's like how to salvage your draft the best when you sort of like try to maybe draft humans and it didn't work, and then you try to draft werewolves and it didn't work, and you got this sort of hybrid. So this looks like a scavenged draft for me, but this is a large cluster of decks and they are quite successful. So maybe those scavenge drafts are not terrible, because maybe you have like a splash bomb in them, or maybe you have yeah, maybe you just went in for a bomb and then you build around it. And unfortunately, bombs, they will not appear to the frequency that I can really say that, oh, there are bombs in this deck, because you know this means that it's in 50% of the decks there is one copy at least. This means that there is more than one copy per deck on average. Rares will appear, I think that the maximum will appear like at 30% of the decks in a cluster will have a particular rare, which is still a lot. When you think that, like 30% of the decks have Alina and whatever and her partner, that's quite a lot, if 30% of the decks in the cluster have it. But it's not enough that for me to show them here, because it's still like one off, and it changes by quite a lot. Right. So now we move to cluster 3, which is slightly below that. And this is basically a wolf deck. Hungry Ridge Wolf, Hook and Mariner, Weaver of Blossoms, Sporeback Wolf, Snarling Wolf, Wolf Strike, Fearful Villager, um, Child of the Pack, Wolfkin Outcast already at uncommon level appear in the 50% of the decks, which is something. But again, surprise things for me is the Downheart Disciple. It's just probably because the Aleatory usually have very good instincts, so I would trust your instincts if I were you. Um, so yeah, again we see the Dawnheart Disciple, which is slightly surprising. But probably this deck wants to have as many 1/2 drops as possible, and it tries to get them wherever it can get it. And like human, 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 human. So there another human. So there are some humans in there, especially when you play them during the day. Which means that it will reliably attack as a 3/3 sort of like Snarling Wolf style, which might be just enough for that format, I guess. If it like every second turn can attack as a 3/3, you're quite happy, especially when it does it reliably in the first few turns, and it seems like it's possible to happen. And again, importantly, these decks have removal because there is the bolt, there is the wolf strike, there is the upgrade and lacerate flesh, but they're not exactly that heavy in removal as the previous ones. And obviously, they don't have the bleed dry potential, so you have to work your way through. And massive might and witch's web sort of split evenly 50-50. You want like one-ish of them in your deck on average. You want one of those tricks, but it doesn't seem like there is a big preference over which one you would prefer. But again, I mean, just by looking at with the exception of the Flame Blessed Bolt, it's mainly creatures in the most common cards, and the rest looks like it's less common. So basically, this is a very heavy creature-based version. Okay, so we look at the cluster 6, and this is I think the biggest cluster of this archetype. And cluster 6 and cluster 7, they will be very similar, most likely. And again, I mean, we see the same things, and this is the thing that I like. This is the mid-range version of the first deck. Like, hi Mercurio, it's going splendidly, and now even better, as you arrived. So yeah, Hungary Ridge Wolf. I think that the why is it was the most common card in multiple clusters. Cluster 3, it was also the most common. Here is also most common. It's probably just because it's there and it's available. If you are drafting red green and you've identified it as an open color, you just get all the Hungry Ridge Wolf that you see because you pick them slightly higher than anyone else, and no one really wants them that much because in many decks it's just a vanilla 2/2. Which arguably is not amazing. So it's probably not that this card is super important. It's just that this card is very available because it's specific for your deck. And if you want to have a successful version of it, you damn make sure that you're not one of the 3 people drafting werewolf at your pod, because that will not end well for you. So you want to get those like Ridge Wolf if you're drafting red green, and that's why you have many of them. Not because they are like super amazing, but because they are there. And while for the Flame Bliss Bolt and a Braid, you really need to compete with your highest picks. And same like Hook and Mariner, you should get those because people are not as high as they probably should be on the card. I think the card is pretty good. And you get Sporeback Wolf, Weaver Blossom. So again, this is like a werewolf deck, but because it has Flourishing Hunter and Falconrat Celebrants, this is sort of like a more mid-rangey version of it. And it also has the Runebound Wolf plan to ping people in the late game and gain reach like this, rather than the previous deck plan that was Child of the Pack, Wolfkin Outcast, and like smash with your creatures that you played earlier. And you see here you don't have those 5 drops at all. It's like Mariner is a 4-drop, Child of the Pack is a 4-drop, and Wolfkin Outcast hopefully is a 4-drop. That's what you're at least aiming for. Well, here you definitely have the Flourishing Hunter, the Celebrants, which are more expensive. So I guess that's what we should call the red-green mid-range deck. And the last one that I decided to put in, because they all looked pretty similar. Also, something got screwed up in the cluster. They should be moved a bit higher, all of them. Okay, and this one is basically again more menace focused. So there's the Fearful Villager, there is the Celebrants, and a card that works very well with that in form of Toxic Scorpion. You get Flourishing Hunter. So this is like similar to the Cluster 6, which shouldn't surprise you because they are quite close from each other, but slightly bigger. So I guess that in red green, the sort of like this is the size gradient. So like the decks here are smaller, the decks here are bigger. But yeah, again, pretty similar because, as I said, not much to play around. But this card appeared in several of those lower clusters, Dormant Grove, because you're closer to making this 3/6, and when you have big creatures that have vigilance, you're probably winning that game. So you know, that's part of strategy that you want to be able to trigger it in a way. And one counter on child, two counters on celebrant, one counter on the blah blah blah. Or is it flourishing hunter? Two counters on hook and mariner, and you get the flip. So probably this deck wants to like upgrade one of your creatures into a much bigger threat, and while at the same time giving everything vigilance, which will be good, especially like those menacing creatures are quite good. And again, yeah, massive might is here. Here actually no what's the name? Which is something, but there is a sure strike instead. But again, you have this one trick, and it's a split between massive might, sure strike, and probably witches. What's the witches? Witches what? Witches web. Probably witches web is somewhere further down, like at 0.4 or 0.3. So yeah, roughly one trick per deck. Focus on the removal. Put some big things, and Falconra Celebrant is still good in any kind of red deck. So yay. Okay, but that's the four clusters I selected for the red green. Now we have the blue black, and here we have quite a large spread here in terms of like where we find successful decks. We find them here, we find them here, we find them here. So it's all over the place, which makes me hopeful that they are looking slightly different from each other. So we start with this one, cluster one. And here, Stitched Assistant is the top common. And this is the story of this archetype in general. And I think it's because the same case as with the wolf in red green. If you draft blue black, Stitched Assistant and Mind Leech Ghoul should be plenty full. And they are not particularly great card. Stitched Assistant is probably like 15 to 20 kind of playable, and Mind Leech Ghoul is like 22, 23. Maybe with some synergies can be popped up a bit. But they should be available, because if they are not available, then what the hell are you doing trying to force blue black? I mean, unless you get some kind of an insane bomb. Wretched Throng is here as well. So as you can see, like Persistent Specimen, Throng, Mind Leech Ghoul to some extent. These are more like things that you sacrifice to exploit than things that exploit themselves. And also important to notice that Throngs are distributed very widely across those decks. So there's probably like a bunch of them that have 0 and a bunch of them that have 2 to 3. And then the average becomes 0.9, but there are some without and some with. The point is that on average, you should have a critical mass of the things that you sacrifice to exploit, and then fill it in with the exploit things. And here you have from the exploit thing, Stitch Assistant is probably the most easy to get. Repository Scab is good in this deck, and that is not said about every blue-black deck. Not all of them are heavy on the spells. And on that note, you have the Chill of the Grave, because it's the easiest thing to get. You have the Bleed Dry, and Lunar Rejection, Syncopate, and probably somewhere far, not far from there, there is the second counter spell. So I have some spell package. It's like not excessive. You still dominate. You still, because the nature of the deck, you need the creatures to sacrifice. You need the creatures to exploit. You can't allow yourself to play too many spells in those decks. So Repository Scab, a nice addition, but not necessarily the the most important card. And you have another good sacrifice fodder in Lantern Bearer and Biolume Egg, which I think this is like the best thing for the exploit deck in terms of like you really can sort of estimate how open is the color combination by getting it somewhat late in the pack one, and then you can decide to go in. If you have a couple of black cards or a couple of blue cards and you think that the archetype is open, Biolume X should be probably good litmus test of how open the format, how open the archetype is. And I might look later in the format into the signals in the Yeah, I might look in the signals of the drafts here a bit later. So I don't think it is. I think that you really want to play it. Although I did have that one game where I played Biolume Egg and my opponent played Rot-Tide Gargantua and exploited it, and I just sacrificed my egg and got a 4/4. They forget that it's any sacrifice. And we have Doom Descender. But look, I mean, one thing that is really important for me to notice is that how many how many of those exploit fodders you have, and it's probably because the exploit creatures are more diversified, and at common levels you get the best rewards for them. So they will not be as plentiful. That's the problem with them. That this archetype is supported heavily on the uncommon level and on the rare level. You need to take that into account when you draft it, that you might not be rewarded because they just might not be any Biolume eggs or whatever diverse caps open. If they are, though, you should be able to get them, because if you're not, again, you're probably not being in the right lane if someone is fighting for you over this archetype. And here you have the diverse cap and skulls cap, the best exploit, I guess, rewards, except for Necroduality, of course. And Archguru of Straben, again, because you sacrifice creatures quite a lot, and because a lot of them are zombies, you might get free draw from them quite regularly. So that's cluster 1. So now we move to cluster 3, which is quite far from it in terms of distance on the plot. But is it really? Look at it. Stitched Assistant, but in much higher numbers. Wretched Trunk, but in much higher numbers. Again, quite some decks with 0 of them in the cluster, but quite some decks with 2, 3. And then Childergrave, Doom Dissenter, Repository Scab, Skull Scab, Mind Leech Ghoul, Lantern Bearer, Rot-Tide Gargantua, Bleed Dry, Desperate Farmer, Persistent Specimen, Archghoul of Straben, Biolume Egg, Diagraph Scavenger. I think that Undying Malice is the only card that is different in here. Numbers are quite different in terms of their quantity, and this one definitely has more School Scab. So this is like School Scab the deck, because you have them like over a 1 on average of an uncommon over a sample of 20 odd decks. That shows you that this tries to make the Skull Scab work. That's probably why Undying Malice is in there. I had only good experience with that card so far, except for when opponent was casting it. So yeah, just a slightly different rearrangement of the same card. And here we go back to the thing I was talking about in the beginning, that this format is sort of like you're drafting on rails, because how archetype specific some cards are, you're just gonna end up with them easily because A, people don't want them because they are not in this archetype, and B, because you want them because you are in this archetype. And it's sort of like completely thins down the depth of the drafting strategy in terms of assembling a deck, and it makes you focus more on not on what you not on how your deck looks like, but how to find an open lane. It's more, you have to focus more on the signal reading and finding what is open, rather than on how to assemble the deck, because the deck will assemble itself, because the cards are sort of telling you what you want to do with them, and that's basically it. All right, cluster 7, yay. And here we have slightly different. Okay, so let's look what cluster 7 is. Like, this is the opposite side of the same. And this is a markedly different deck. This is not an exploit deck, really. There is still some things that exploit because it's hard to avoid them, but this is your Dimir control, basically. Diagraph Scavenger, Bleed Dry, Blood Fountain for attrition, Cruel Witness for beatdown in the air after you stabilize the board, Desperate Farmer so you don't die, Stitched Assistant, and Rot-Tide Gargantua. They're sort of like the exploit things, but they can gain you some kind of value from your cheap creatures that you need to have anyway. And you have Scattered Thoughts, Grisly Ritual. These are like classic control cards. And here you have like at the lower rate, you have the Mind Leech, Ghoul, Lantern Bearer, and Persistent Specimen. So your fodders, and you have the Repository Scab, which actually surprises me that it's so low here, because here you have much more spells. but maybe also much less support for exploiting, and that's why you don't want to overdo it on them. And some skull caps and some of those decks, they do have the wretched trunk package basically. But this is the more of a demure control than the exploit, going hardcore on exploit, as you can see. So there is a possibility of building the classic attrition and demure control, um, like back from 3 years ago or something. And the last one, that's close to it, so it's probably going to be similar, but it has you know um, a bit of a change. Desperate Farmer is the most common creature here, because you have a capability of sacrificing creatures at will uh, due to your exploit triggers. Farmer can be quite good in some of those decks because you can easily flip it to a 4/3 lifelinker, which is not bad for 3 mana. Um, and you will have your Doomed Dissenters, your Persistent Specimens that you can play quite early, and you have some cheap or not so cheap exploit creatures that you will be able to activate it. And it's again this sort of like more attrition-y version with a bit more, I think, exploit in this particular case than in the other ones. Uh, again, Undead Butler, a very good attrition-y card that you can use as a sacrifice fodder later in the game. But very similar to the previous one, it just shows you that there's more than one way of assembling this deck, and you can either go all in on the exploit strategies, or you can basically build a solid classic control deck and put some pepper in some exploit synergies in there. Right. And this is the last archetype because, as I said, I didn't prepare the white blue yet, because those analyses last a lot. I think that this presentation, it looks dodgy, but it's 12 hours of work, 12 hours of getting the data analyzed. Yay, go me! What a waste of time. But okay, here we have the white green clusters. Okay, so we start with cluster number 1. And this is a sort of hybrid, like we saw the hybrid of humans and werewolves in red green, and this is, I think, more or less the same in. Oh, thank you, Hyder. This is more or less the same thing in white green. So we have some wolves, we have some humans, and because they sometimes overlap, because werewolves are humans and blah blah blah, you can sort of make this kind of a value deck. And I think that this is one of the better ways of drafting white green that I found in the data. And it's just like, basically, you don't try to go super all in on training. You might put some here and there, but you want to make this the kind of deck that stalls the ground, has explosive starts, sometimes will overcome the opponent, and has the plan B in Griff Rider, or some other flyers that can like finish the games if you create a board stall. They don't have problems with breaking it, and I played a couple of decks like that, and they worked fine. I mean, in my hands, they did 5 wins, which is for this format a success for me. Okay, we go to cluster 6. I only picked the clusters that I found that are really interesting. And here we have like a cluster of hardcore going on to the training. So you can build a training deck that is okay. It's probably not easy, and I'm pretty sure that those decks are supported by odd rares that will make them tick. But here you have like Parish Blade Trainee and Traveling Minister and Griff Rider as the 3 most common things. And then we have Dawnheart Disciple, Militia Rallier. Those things will enable training, so that 3 power will be 3 power most of the games. 3 power, 3 power, things that will let you train to the higher level. There's even the Estwold Shield Basher here, 4 power, Resistance Squad, 3 power. So basically what it says, that except for the training creatures, other creatures that you want to play probably should be aiming at 3 power so they can train efficiently. But like there is an odd Vampire Slayer, but that's just probably because you can, because there is nothing else that you could have drafted in the 2-drop spot, basically. and the kindly ancestor, because kindly ancestor is just going to be good due to its 2/1 potential. Oh yeah, Droxcall infantry is also here. But there is definitely a preference for having this free power, because that will train quite well, and it's not so easy to kill most of the time. And cluster 9, the odd one. And here, this is like sort of almost semi-control deck in terms. I mean, it will have explosive starts. Like, it's maybe Selesnya Tempo. Is that the right description? You have some early things. So you have the Traveling Minister, you have the Droxcall Infantry, Griff Rider, you have the Sigardian Paladin. Oh, the axis here, it doesn't represent anything. Humble Slug is asking what this axis represent. So basically, these are the decks that are plotted based on their similarity. So the two dots are close. It means that decks have a similar composition. If the two dots are apart, the decks have less similar composition. But since they are all within the same color pair, obviously the composition is going to be relatively close to each other. And the only problem is also that the flattening of the. So basically, I'm converting every deck into numbers and then putting those numbers on the two-dimensional space. But the problem is that I'm putting multi-dimensional things on two-dimensional things, which makes some distortions, but they should be minor, I would say. And basically, based on that, I can divide them into clusters of similar decks. And since they're similar in composition, I'm assuming that they're similar in plan. And then I'm looking at the clusters of the decks that are. So basically, these are all the 2000 decks that I analyze. And these are the ones that have the highest win rates together with their neighbors. So I'm looking at the average win rate of this deck plus 20 of its closest neighbors, and the ones in color here are the ones that have highest. These are the 200 decks that have highest win rates when you look at them and their neighbors. And then I just basically remove all the gray dots from this plot and then got into this and to look at the clusters, and I am describing what's in each cluster. Now we're, I think, in the last cluster of the white-green. So yeah, this is sort of like, there is a training package in there, but there's plenty of removal in this one. So there's like Circle of Confinement, Fierce Retribution, Sigarda's Imprisonment, Valorous Stance. So this is sort of like, because it has both aggressive creature and removal, I will very reluctantly call it tempo, I guess, because it's not a control really. Tap out control. I don't know how to call it, but I mean, it's markedly different. There is also flyers, which sort of like, again, you can block the board. Well, this is the example deck, really. I mean, this is the most common cards in that build, and these are just the number of each card uh, in the decks, basically. So yeah, I don't know how to call it, but I mean, it definitely looks like something to look for. That you have this explosive start potential. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 flyers, which is a large amount of flyers. And I noticed that those white decks that have multiple flyers can do some nasty things in the late game against other decks, especially when you manage to gain some life with Traveling Ministers, and then you have a couple of jumpers to block big creatures. They seem to be working relatively fine. So yeah, that's the cluster number 9, basically. Which I'm still not sure if I should call it the control or tempo. Tempo control. Pivoting deck. Can go aggro, can go defensive, and then finish off with the flyers. Call it what you want, but I mean, you know more or less what I mean. And that's it. That's how far I managed to get with this analysis. Now, okay, there is one last thing that I didn't talk about, and I don't have slides. Maybe I'll do slides for the next presentation just to show you. But I told you that I make skeletons for every archetype before the format starts. So skeletons are like those mock versions of decks, and And I did the analysis for the color pairs that I'm analyzing here, and mixed bag, I would say. Like I did a pretty good black red skeleton. I did a really bad red green skeleton. Then blue black was like medium, and actually white green, my white green skeleton was in one of those blue dots, so actually my skeleton was on the level of the top 10% decks, which is fine. And then I didn't talk about blue white yet, but my blue white was probably one of the 100 bottom decks. So yeah, swings and roundabouts when you start predicting things before they happen. But yeah, hopefully you can at least get a decent impression of how do different builds of those archetypes can look, apart from the canonical versions that will be driven by what WotC tells you that you should draft. There are some variations in how the decks are built. It's not as visible as it was in Midnight Hunt. In Midnight Hunt, I could look at the blue black and I had like 14 different clusters, and those clusters were really different. I had the Flyers clusters, I had the attrition deck, I had like zombie, I had the zombie control and whatever. Spells or almost deck, and you could see those different clusters that were pretty successful. So you had more flexibility on how you build the archetypes. Here, because of the cards being specific for archetypes, you are a bit limited. And it, again, this is something that struck me when I looked at the frequency of drafting. This is more like it's between Strixhaven, which was a guild set, and a normal set. So it's not 100% 10 color combination deck format. It's more like five main colors, main color pairs, and five supplementary color pairs. Very much like Ikoria was with obviously in the Ikoria it was enemy colors that were promoted, and allied colors were the supplementary ones that you drafted once in a while because you opened a busted rare in the color pair. So yeah, think about it, and because of that, of course, they need to funnel you into right archetypes, and because they funnel you into the right archetypes, you have less liberty of how you can build your deck because you're basically dependent on commons that fit in your archetype, which are not all of them. So you only use a subset of the common cards in each color pair, which means that you draft green, but not every green card will go in your deck, so you have to just ship some of the green cards. So this is the clustering for the white blue, and you can see that there is one cluster here, there's some clusters here, there is something here, there is this maybe, and these ones, they're slightly different. So I divided them and I numbered them and I looked what's inside of those clusters. So basically I looked at the average number of each particular card in each cluster, and then basically I'm going to show you the most common cards in not in each cluster, but in some select clusters that I thought maybe are more interesting than the others. So I started with cluster number 1, just because it's quite far away from everything else and it's quite large, so it might be something interesting. This is a pretty aggro oriented cluster, it seems to me, that I think is trying to be tempo basically, and trying to be skies. So we have 3 copies on average of traveling ministers and lantern bearers. So it seems like this is like, and this is based on quite a lot of decks, because you can see how many dots are here, probably 30 decks inside. So on average, they have the 3 copies of traveling minister and lantern bearer. So 1-drops are super, super important. And I can tell you already that in every single cluster in blue-white, lantern bearer was either on top. In most of them, it was on top as the most common thing, and it was definitely more than 1 copy of it on average. And or maybe it was second in a couple of them, like in here, but by very little. And yeah, definitely the most important card for the archetype if you want to be successful. This deck also has a average of 1 copy of Wretched Throng, but of course, when 1 copy of Wretched Throng is not the most optimal. It's not optimal. There's no such thing as a most optimal. 1 copy of Wretched Throng is not optimal. So actually, when you look at the data, There is a bunch of decks that have 0, and there is a bunch of decks that have 2, 3. On average, you end up with 1. So it's not in every deck. It's in some decks, but in some decks, it seems like it's pretty decent. Then you have some interaction. You got the Fierce Retribution, Sigarda's Imprisonment, Chill the Grave, which is not going to cost you probably little, but with Wretched Throng, that is a zombie, it actually gets the mana discount. And there's also a couple of Stitch assistants peppered in, so maybe you can play it for 2 mana, but it's a good tempo card that will allow you to race. Talking about racing, there is also Heron of Hope, Kindly Ancestor, and of course Heron of Hope with Minister allows you racing quite successfully, even though your power is not so great, because you will gain enough life to outrace some decks. Then you have things that you would expect: Drogskull Infantry, Kindly Ancestor, Nurturing Presence is also particularly good in blue-white decks, and there is almost 1 copy on average in those decks. There is the top end in Angelic Quartermaster, which will let you to put a couple of counters on your mediocre flyers. There's Brian. Brian is obviously good in those decks, but it's not like super heavily featured here. There are clusters that have more of it. And there's Griff Rider, which probably will not be trained a lot, but just as a 2-1 flyer is probably good in this particular deck. And markedly better than the 2-3 flyer, I guess, because it can block when need be. And there's the Stitched Assistant, there's some card draw, and Parish Blade Trainee. This is like a sort of generic deck that sort of in the skies, blue-white skies kind of mood. Okay, so next is cluster 3, which is this one here. So I guess that this could be treated as a sort of mega cluster, really, but because the distances in this cluster are quite big, I split them into very arbitrary chunks. And here again, we see Lantern Bearers, the top common. One thing that is maybe worth noting is that almost every single successful cluster of decks in blue-white, because I'm not only checking the cards but also lands, almost all of them had more islands than plains. So they seem to be leaning on blue heavier than on white if they are successful. So something to see. Here we have Lantern Bearer, Wretched Throng, Cruel Witness, which is the 3/3 flyer. There is also over 1 copy of that. So this one at least tries to probably kill with this kind of combination of the Lantern Bearer, some jumping with Wretched Throng, and then putting some flyers and killing them. Traveling Minister, obviously a good card. And again, we see the same kind of thing. Nurturing Present, Drogskull Infantry, Kindly Ancestor, Brian Comer. Here we have Diver's Cab and Stitched Assistant. So there is a potential with especially several Throngs that you can at relatively low cost sacrifice something to get those exploit triggers. And the rest of the cards, except for Selhoff and Tumor, which I guess is there just for being a 2 mana 1/3 really, because 2 mana 1/3 can stop quite some attacks in this format. It's for racing purposes as an obstacle. You can probably replace it with a 3/3 wall creature. And we have Lunar Rejection as expansion of the removal package here. Worth noting, this one is pretty much lower on the enchantment synergies, it seems to me, although there is a Nurturing Present and there is still the Brian Comer, but it looks slightly lower than the first version to me on those enchantment synergies. So next one is the cluster number 6. Again, Lantern Bearer, Cruel Witness, Kindly Ancestor, Fierce Retribution, Drogskull Infantry, and you see a theme. They are quite similar actually between them, but this is a more controlled version, as I called it in my head when I was building the presentation. It does have differences on those rarer cards. So there is the Scattered Thoughts, the card draw card, there's Syncopate. Just outside of that, there was the other counter spell, plus Cradle of Safety, Chill the Grave. This deck plays much more on the instant scale of things. There's Fierce Retribution. I think that the White Shock, the deal 1 to attacking creature, was also very close to making the cut for my combination of cards. So yeah, this one is a bit more playing on the instant axis, and it has like those bottleneck stoppers and like binding guys, like Droxcal infantry can block something early and then come back later. And then the plan of finishing the game with some flyers from either Brian Comer um, or from Honor Blessed Geist. You have Heron of Hope, so you have some flying finishers, and with Crew of Witness, I guess. I guess Crew of Witness is also there because it's quite easy to draft. It's if blue is open, you're gonna get a couple of copies of that easily, and that can be your plan for finishing the game, like 3/3 flyers, really. And in between, you have the usual, because you play both counter spells and things like Chill of the Grave. You can sort of decide how you want to raise them. If they play a card that is not important enough, you can ignore countering it and then Chill the Grave something else to clear the path for your attacks. Yeah, I guess that this is what I call the blue-white control, as opposed to the previous ones, which were slightly more aggro. Like you can see that there's fewer traveling ministers, for example, in here. And there is the last cluster that I'm going to talk, the cluster number 9. And again, it does look similar. Lantern Bearer, still 1.7 copies per deck, which is quite a lot. You have the Binding Guests, Geist, you have Brian Comer. Importantly, the Cradle of Safety is quite high in this deck. And probably this is because, these decks have 0.7 copies of Catilda in them. And they had also average of half a copy of Dorothea. So this is a sort of bomb build, bomb-based build of the deck. When you have the Catilda, then you can play easily something like Binding Guys because you can replay it as an enchantment, and then it makes your Catilda quite more powerful. And the rest is just defensive. So you get the Piercing Light, you get Valorous Stance, you get Fierce Retribution, you get some counters, Siphon Essence, Geistlight Snare. So you basically defend yourself, and you'd hope that you're going to finish either with Catilda or with some creature that is boosted by Dorothea and can attack and generate the 4/4 as it does. So yeah, again, this is also a slightly more instant-based version of the deck with, of course, some enchantments for boosting things like Catilda. And you can see that, these two basically are more enchantment-based, instant-based, and that probably is the axis, that this is sort of more aggressive or on the top, and then as you go down, you get more defensive decks. All right. So, having said that, I'm gonna call it an evening today because it's been a long day and I still need to do a lot of cooking tomorrow. So I would like to thank 17 Lands team, who are, as always, amazing, and they always give me the data, and they are interesting to follow. Actually, 17 Lands had a couple of days ago the look at whether Crimson VOW is a princely or poppery format. I would like to recommend checking through their Twitter account at 17 Lands to see that. And all the people that I'm mentioning here are in the dev team of the 17 Lands. As you may or may not know, I'm merely parasiting on the 17 Lands data with minor contribution towards how the site operates, because I'm not a programmer. So yeah, I definitely want to give back some love to them, as they do deserve it. And thanks to Diogo, who is a person that helped me and will help me more in developing my streaming platform, because it's rubbish, because I'm rubbish in those things. So I need someone to help me, and Diogo is very kindly offered to help me in small things to make the stream manageable for viewers.